Welcome to Misteria, Larry Arnold. I'm really pleased to welcome you to my show. It's great to have you as my first guest.
Thank you, sir. We're delighted to be with you and your listeners for this intriguing discussion that we're about to have.
It certainly will be. It certainly will be. Thank you so much. Okay, so first thing I'd like to ask you is, how did you get into this? I know you've been researching this phenomenon for some decades now, I think from the 1960s, was it?
Well, we were introduced to the subject of spontaneous human combustion in the early 60s when we were in, we think, 8th grade.
Wow.
And we purchased for like 25 or 35 cents a paperback book called Stranger Than Science by Frank Edwards. In that book, a collection of 40 mysteries and curiosities and stuff, he had one chapter called The Cinder Woman. And it was about a lady who, here in the States, in Florida and St. Petersburg, back in July of 1951, met what seemed to be an incredibly bizarre burning death in which the body was reduced to a foot, a few pieces of calcined vertebrae, what was said to be her shrunken head, shrunken down to about this size, and no other significant fire damage in the apartment that she lived in at the time. And this fit the definition of what history has defined as spontaneous human combustion, an incredibly localized fire that produces a massive amount of destruction to the human body itself. That made us curious. And when we talked to our teachers and professors later on about this thing, they had never heard about it. And if they cared to comment at all, it was like, well, the body can't burn that way. That's impossible. After we left college, mechanical engineering, we decided to go back and look at this case of the Cinder Woman, Mary Reeser, and went down to the Library of Congress to pull up microfilm from local newspapers in the St. Petersburg area at that time to see if this was front page news or Frank Edwards had simply made up a fascinating but completely false story. What we discovered was that in 1951, this was front page news in the local newspapers down in St. Pete, Florida. This was really a mystery. How could this woman have burned so completely in an environment that was significantly devoid of any other heat or flame damage? The case remained unsolved for a month. And then suddenly, surprisingly, the authorities said she burned up in a chair fire because she dropped a cigarette on her lap. Well, we have thousands of fire fatalities in America every year. You have more fire fatalities in the UK. If this was the explanation that made common sense, we should expect to find lots of cases of ashen bodies every year because more people die by smoking mishaps in this country than by any other fire-related cause.
Right.
We don't find that. A case like Mary Reeser is extremely rare. And then in 1975, we got tipped off to a similar sounding case here in Pennsylvania. Mary Reeser, by the way, has a connection to our home state of Pennsylvania. This case happened to an elderly physician in the northern part of Pennsylvania by the name of Dr. John Irving Bentley. Sounded like us, but we're not making any guesses, so we started to investigate that case. We tracked down the person who first discovered the fire scene. We spoke to his fellow firefighters and looked into identifying everyone that we could talk to about what happened to Dr. John Irving Bentley overnight on December 5, 1966. Sounded intriguing. And then we got the photograph from the photographer who took one of the most amazing medical photographs in history. It showed a hole on a bathroom floor. Atop that hole was an aluminum walker that Dr. Bentley used to locomote through his two-room apartment. Tangential to that was half of what the discoverer thought was a mannequin leg. And he was a volunteer fireman. His name was Don Gosnell. And he'd been in the house to read Dr. Bentley's gas meter in the basement. While he was down in the basement, he kicked up with his work boot a pile of ash that was about 15 inches in diameter, 5 inches in height, and looked overhead and saw a hole in the basement ceiling and wondered what had burned overnight or why had his colleagues and himself as a volunteer firefighter not been called to the Bentley home to put out this localized fire. When he bent down closer, being up in Dr. Bentley's bathroom now, he realized this was not a mannequin leg, but it was half of a human leg, and that the ashes that he had kicked a few moments earlier down in the basement had to be the body, in quotes, of Dr. Bentley. An amazingly localized fire that consumed all but Dr. Bentley's partial leg and a head. Everything else was powdery residue. We went to that fire scene, very low ceiling. We stand 6 feet. We could stretch our arm up and touch the ceiling. Not a scorch mark on the ceiling. The aluminum walker depicted in the photograph would melt at 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. It's intact. Rubber tips on the walker's legs are also intact. The bathtub that is directly above the perimeter of the hole to which Dr. Bentley immolated is painted with enamel paint. The paint did not blister. Now, you can buy paint by holding a lit match near it. So how did this 92-year-old, 180-pound country doctor manage to immolate more completely than can be done in a crematorium retort and he did not blister paint, melt aluminum, or singe the ceiling directly above the hole through which his body fell. When we saw that photograph combined with the evidence of the first responders whom we were able to interview, we knew that we had one now to a second case, Mrs. Reeser and now Dr. Bentley. Prior to this, we had looked at photographs in a whole slew of medical forensic textbooks, some of which are frankly quite gruesome. But none of the photographs of fire fatality victims replicated, emulated, or duplicated the photographs that we had for Mary Reeser and now for Dr. Bentley. This told us that we were onto something that medical science and science in general was not prepared to cope with nor to explain. And when we got the photograph of Dr. Bentley, it changed our life. It put us on a whole new career path, that in part we have spent 50 years now traveling the world, talking to first responders, amassing incredible photographic documentation that this thing that history has called spontaneous human combustion, that we prefer to call in the classic cases sudden human cremation, because that's what it is something that we've chosen to pursue, try to understand, and at least document. It's been quite
incredible. I can imagine, Larry. I will say with the doctor, when I was a young child, I got hold of a magazine called Unexplained, and I've got the magazine booklet for the book of the magazine. And I found that case when I was like 11 years old with Dr. Bentley. And that's one of the things that spurred me up in my research into all sorts of things. So I've still got it to this day. I got it on a car boot sale. But yes, there were a few cases in there which quite frankly blew my mind. This show's about looking through all the mysterious things, because we live in a very mysterious world and a very mysterious universe. And SHC fits right into that remit, quite frankly. So that's why I'm very glad I got you on. So there were quite a few cases in there. I was surprised at how many there were, really. They trace back quite far in history. You know, I know some people have claimed causes for it, like the wicking effect and stuff, and claiming modern clothing like polyesters and things setting on fire and all that. But if you can trace it back to when people weren't wearing any sort of man-made fibers, then that takes a lot of that out of it, doesn't it? So what would you say is...
Thank you for recognizing that.
Thank you.
53 of memory serves. It involved a knight named Polonus, a Polish knight who several decades before that was said to have been drinking a couple ladles of strong spirit and suddenly was totally consumed. And the emphasis on totally consumed before his barmaids.
Whoa.
And that clearly would, if we take Bartholini's statement, his words as actual fact, as truth, then this certainly sounds like not a smoking mishap accident at the bar, but something far more interesting, intriguing, and bizarre. For the body to be totally consumed tells us that he was burned to the extent that Dr. Bentley or Mary Reeser were consumed. Which then would fit the definition of spontaneous human combustion. We're actually the first researcher to put a name to that case. It was published in medieval Latin. We were able to find a professor who could translate it for us and put the name to that case. We also looked at the subject prior to the 1500s. And by believing that this phenomenon really does occur, we can find accounts that seem to describe this phenomenal event that go back thousands of years into Greek times, Roman times, and Nordic times. So in our view, this is a phenomenon that has afflicted mankind for millennia. And still to this day, as we are speaking to you in 2025, it is not accepted, not recognized by mainstream medical science.
It's quite incredible that it's not. It's often found to be easier to find some form of basic answer to shut everything down. If something contradicts what the mainstream says about anything, people don't like to look outside of that. It causes too many questions. Indeed. People often don't want the answers to those things. I mean, I looked into it a little bit, and I know there was a Countess Bandy, I think. She died in 1735, something like that. That was a pretty famous case that people referred back to. And then looking into it, and she, you know, they found her. They can't all be alcoholics who've magically got near a flame and set a fire, can they? It just doesn't work.
No, it doesn't work. And thank you for knowing that. In 1850, a famous German chemist, scientist, Justin von Liebig, decided to look into the phenomenon of SHC to see whether or not it was a real event. His premise was that only elderly females who were drunken sots because they just drank so much, their tissues was impregnated with alcoholic fluid. And the alcohol for him was the fuel that might consume a body. Oh, he did experiments along that line and found that his burn samples did not transform into ashes. We've done the same experiments multiple times in the early stages of our investigation because our premise is, as a scientist, we think with some critical thinking skills, if this can be explained by the Wick effect, which is what von Liebig was trying to demonstrate. If it can be proved that way and demonstrated that way, then this no longer becomes a mystery. We'll find something else curious to turn our attention to. Every experiment that we have done has failed to replicate a scene like Mary Reeser or Dr. Bentley or Countess Bondi. In fact, one experiment that we did for the BBC television, we had a ham shank sample, bone included, because one of the experiments ABC television uses, for example, a sliver of fat wrapped in cheesecloth held over a burning Bunsen burner, as if that truly replicates an adult human body.
Oh, wow.
No, but in our case, we took a ham shank with bone, marinated it for a full year in a marinade of whiskey, brandy, and vodka, saturated completely with alcohol, wrapped it up in cotton, laid it on tar-based linoleum like was on Dr. Bentley's floor in 1966, outside, infinite amount of oxygen, light breeze to fuel a flame, and put a match to it. BBC filmed this. When the fire self-extinguished, we had basically 99% of the sample still intact. The superficial charring on the surface of the fat. We did not have a pile of dry powder. And yet, that program decided, yeah, we'll kind of ignore that experiment, and we're going to fall back and rely on the Wick effect, the big elephant in the room on this subject, to explain away mystery to so-called spontaneous supercombustion. Do not misrepresent the data. Do not lie about the evidence. That'll not make us very happy. And that's not good science either, is it?
Absolutely not. You're supposed to go where the data shows you. The data there patently proves that it's impossible. Just doesn't make sense, Surely, even with the people who self-immolated, the Buddhists in the 60s or whatever in protests, they didn't cremate. They were horribly burned, certainly, but it didn't reduce their bones to nothing. It's like, could be up to 1600 degrees to burn an entire human. That's just
Actually,
not
it's more
happening.
under retort conditions, it is higher temperature than that. A retort, at least
Wow.
in this country, normally exposes the cadaver to 22 to 2400 degrees Fahrenheit for 60 to 90 minutes, and then the temperature is lowered in the retort to 17 to 1800 degrees for another hour and a half to possibly 2.5 hours to cremate the body. Point here, what is removed from the retort oven is not ash, but bone fragments. Those bone fragments are put in a cremulator, which mechanically grinds the bone pieces powder that's put in an urn for the next of kin. If a crematorium, the people who invoke the Wick premise to explain away SHC often say, well, people who operate retorts, they're burning the body under quicker conditions, and it's just a business model. Point. Consider this. There's not a horde of cadavers stacking up around crematoriums, at least not in America. So there's no urgency to do this. Crematorium operators are business people. They're there to provide a service, but also to make a profit. Why would they spend $100,000, almost that many pounds, to buy a retort, to buy filtration equipment, to pay licensing fees, to acquire 40 to 50 gallons of fuel oil or 1 to 2 million cubic feet of natural gas, to ash in a cadaver over a few hours? When for the price of a cigarette, if you're going to Wick effect, they can lay a lit cigarette on the cadaver, walk away, have a casual 3-martini lunch, come back and scrape up with a hand the ash and put it in the urn. The reason they don't do that, and we have spoken to many crematorium owners and operators, the reason they don't do that is quite simple. Because they can't.
It's like with crop circles, which a lot of people say it's some guys with some planks wandering around and stuff. And when Doug and Dave came out like that, we went, ooh, fair enough, that case solved. Meanwhile, these things are appearing in broad daylight at Stonehenge, where the security guard walked around and 15 minutes earlier wasn't there. And people have seen them appear after that sort of thing. Any sort of excuse to keep the status quo.
We remember seeing an interview that Doug and Dave gave for ABC television in this country. And they stood there on camera explaining how they did these incredible formations with their rope and plank. And they also said that they only do this when the moon was full, because they needed the lunar light to see what they were doing.
Right.
Well, even by that time, there were formations all in many parts of the UK and across the Channel in Europe. Now, how are
Mm-hmm.
these two blokes transporting themselves in the dead of night across the Channel to stop around a field in France or Germany and get
Yes.
back across the Channel before daylight arrives and they get back in bed with their spouses?
Yes, because I know their wives apparently never noticed. I know we're getting off a bit off topic here, Larry, but I've been in a few crop circles, but I was in one and it was multiple circles in a giant ring. And you know, they bend internodally and stuff and it's not all stamped down. But some pigeons had been sitting in these circles when whatever hit. And one in the third lake, which was underneath, it just taken a pigeon with it. So the feathers had just tracked all the way around it. But in another one, we found where the parts of a pigeon, its feathers had been blanched white and parts of it had been heat fused to the crop somehow. You can't do
Oh,
that
wow.
with some planks. So in America, you're in Pennsylvania. That's an interesting part of the world for mysterious things occurring also. Have there ever been any SHCs in Pennsylvania?
How interesting for you to ask. We're a native of Pennsylvania,
Mm-hmm.
which in the UK it includes Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. So we're middle Atlantic area along pretty much the Atlantic coast. Mary Reeser, the victim that got us first introduced to this phenomenal subject, it was a Pennsylvania native. And although she died in Florida, her ashes were brought back and interred in Pennsylvania, actually about 10 miles from where you and we are talking now, and
Oh, wow.
10 miles opposite direction from where we grew up. In fact, 5 days ago, we revisited her tombstone and, paid our respects to her and kind of hope maybe she'd give us some insight to how she managed her incredible incendiary feat. That's one Pennsylvania case. Dr. Bentley that we mentioned earlier that changed our career happened in northern Pennsylvania back in 1966 in an area that is a locus for a whole gamut of Fortean phenomena,
Right, yes.
including something that we discovered in the Potter County area of northern Pennsylvania, and that being a bona fide anomaly triangle defined by 5 thermal anomalies. Thermal anomalies being where water will freeze in the spring or into the summer months, but not freeze in the cold winter months. Those 5 points fall on the perimeter of a triangle that is about 27 square miles in area. In fact, if you would go up there today or this week, you could go to the Sweden Valley ice mine and find yourself surrounded, if you were allowed to go into the pit, as we were when we bit. Go into the pit surrounded by icicles, some of which could be as large as telephone poles.
Whoa, it's amazing.
In the center of this triangle,
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Bentley immolated in
Really?
1960. Really?
Whoa.
So a
Wow.
lot of other weird stuff going in that area. Third case, Pennsylvania, also one that we discovered and about our research. If we had not doggedly pursued many of these cases, they would be unknown to this date. In the Bentley case, 1966, the first responders were so aghast by what they witnessed that they could not explain, that they did not even tell his son and his son's wife the true details of how he died. They discovered how Dr. Bentley transitioned by watching us discuss that program on television for ABC. TV's program, That's Incredible, back in 1980. The next case that we discovered and has brought to the public's attention involved another lady from Pennsylvania by the name of Helen Conway. In November of 1964, she was a widow. She was 49 years of age. She was she was still an active businesswoman living outside of Philadelphia. We got tipped off to this case when we were given special permission to attend an advanced arson education course at the Pennsylvania Fire Academy. As a non-firefighter, normally we would not get access to that. Someone who knew about our research and took our interest seriously gave us permission to attend that course. At the end of that course, the instructor handed around a photograph saying, "This is a photograph that I just received that some people say might be spontaneous human combustion. 2 legs in front of a chair." Well, he first said it was a chair fire. We thought, it's Mrs. Reeser. Ta-da. Until the photograph got in our hands, and it consisted of 2 legs propped up against the front of a chair in which a fearsome fire had occurred. Well, this isn't Mrs. Reeser. This is a case we know nothing about. We immediately went to the professor and said, who, when, where? He said, all I know is it happened somewhere down in the southeast part of the state. That's Philadelphia. That's 5 million people at least. No name, no date. It took us 8 months, but we found the case. And when we got the photographs taken by the fire photographer or the fire marshal for Upper Darby Township, blew us away. Mrs. Conway left behind that Sunday morning in November of 1964, 2 legs propped up in front of her chair. Go beyond the knees, you find really badly burned body parts with fifth-degree burns. The left forearm was raised up. The burn was to the bone, to the ulna. Dangling from her ulna was a metal charm bracelet, unmelted. She was semi-invalidic. She used a brass belt to summon assistance. On her right thigh, horrifically burned, heat lacerated, is the brass belt. The brass is unmelted. Its wood handle is completely intact. No odor of combustion, human flesh at that scene. And people who deal with fatal fires tell us one of the most horrific memories they have of a fire fatality is the odor. It's really noxious. In her case, no odor. In Bentley's case, a sweet redolent scent reported by the discoverer, Don Gosnell. The neighbor of Dr. Bentley across the street recently told us that morning she smelled something that was completely unexpected for her that she likened to barbecued steak. In Mary Reese's case, once again, a sweet redolent perfume-like scent. We have a case from Bolingbrook, Illinois, outside of Chicago, in which the son of the victim told us that when he entered his home to know that his mother had incinerated there, the smell in the house was that of hickory incense, completely atypical of normal fatal fires. Back to Mrs. Conway outside of Philadelphia. We spoke to the fire chief, the assistant fire marshal, and the fire photographer who later advanced up the chain of command to become fire marshal for Upper Darby. To a man, they told us, and this is one of the most significant things about the Conway case, besides the amazing photographs that were given to us, is the time element. Skeptics of SHC, as you well know, and your listeners probably can easily imagine, said that these victims all burn up in their body fat under a low temperature, smoldering combustion that lasts for many, many hours. They can say that, but they can't say it honestly, because we have the time element locked down for Conway. From the time that the fire crew told us that she was known to be alive until they arrived, responding to a fire call, to a fire scene that required no fire extinguishment, was 360 seconds, 6 minutes.
That's incredible.
Nobody can explain this to us. Not the most ardent detractor, which in this case would have been Dr. John DeHaan, who until his transition a couple years ago was considered America's god of fire science. His words to us was, well, there must be something else about this case, Larry. Yeah, there is something else. It's something else that is currently unexplained. It's not the Wick effect, what he complained and used to explain how Mrs. Conway and Dr. Bentley and Mary Meeser and hundreds of other like fire fatalities can be explained cogently and rationally. It just doesn't work. One of our detractors, a forensic anthropologist in this country, claims that she's done research in how cadavers can burn, but she also says that even in the worst burned body, she can find evidence of foul play, a gunshot wound, a stab wound. We challenge her and anyone else who disbelieves in SHC to find evidence of foul play, a gunshot wound, or a stab injury in Dr. Bentley's ashes. Good luck.
Yeah.
You
I
can't do it.
Okay. Yeah, there often seems to be people alone and have been locked in and no one's broken in and no one's sneaked in and done anything mischievous to them. So it doesn't make sense. I find it incredible that to say they're burning at such an incredible temperature that, as you said, the things around them or things upon them, they're not going with it, which they certainly should do. And you'd think that this fire would just spread if the whole, things are lightly charred around them sometimes, and stuff that would have melted is near them, but none of it yet. It's burnt at such a temperature, which I find to be incredible.